Hi, I'm Stephanie Arell. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about shame, but instead of looking at shame and guilt or shame and rage, I'm going to consider something I call the logic of exposure, which is the reality that when shame emerges in our body or when we react in shame, it's usually under the gaze of someone else. So that person can be real or perceived, right? So you can imagine in your mind a moment where you felt shame or embarrassed, and usually it's because somebody else's gaze is looking upon you. A lot of times the feeling or the affect of shame emerges because we recognize that the person who's viewing us is not looking at us authentically as us, but misinterpreting who we are. So that incurs this sense of a lower sense of self-worth, for instance. So if you can think of any structure where someone feels invisible or not seen, the affect that would go along with that generally would be the affect of shame. Now, that person could also be imagined, right? So we don't have to actually have a person in front of us when we have this effective response of shame. We can imagine a relationship with somebody or the presence of some ideal person and have a sense of shame because we feel as if we don't measure up or that we somehow fail in that person's ideals perception of ourselves. Always, though, in my mind, in the way that I think about shame, this exchange happens under a logic of exposure. Now, why is that important? Well, today what I want to add to this discussion related to shame is the idea of empathy, which I've talked about before in relationship to sympathy. But what I want to show you is that empathy is a capacity we have, but it also takes place within this logic of exposure. And so it happens to be the resolution in my mind to the shame experience. So the easiest way to think about this in terms of the logic of exposure is about eyesight. So in my video on empathy, I talk about how the empathic exchange can be facilitated through our eyesight with another person. It's very difficult to sustain eyesight. And I think I also mentioned this in a prior video about shame. So if somebody's experiencing a sense of shame, a sense of lowered self-worth, a sense of disgust with themselves, a sense of humiliation, that the simple act of having eye contact with someone else that creates this empathic exchange can actually counter the shame experience. But it takes a lot, right? It requires a vulnerability, which is the exact opposite of what shame wants to facilitate. So throughout this entire video, what I'm going to lay out for you is a chart that we'll show while I'm speaking, and then help you understand how shame can be countered by empathy or an empathic exchange. In thinking about shame versus empathy, let's first talk about the sensory orientation. If we're talking about a logic of exposure, the sensory orientation is going to have to do with the visible realm. So we're always thinking about things that can be seen or not seen or invisible or visible. So when you think about shame and empathy, there's a sort of need for presence. Imagined or real, but present. And generally that's going to be in the presence of another person. So shame and humiliation happens in relationship. Imagined or real, but still in the exchange with someone else. Empathy develops, occurs, is created through the exchange of a real or imagined other. Now, when we conceptualize shame, think about Eve in the garden, and Eve, after being admonished by Satan, runs and hides with Adam. But we like Eve. Running and hiding, covering the body, feeling shame about one's body, oneself, one's self-worth. That's the conceptualization. Now, when we think about empathy, again, it's the opposite. It's this idea of uncovering, maybe not necessarily close, but the idea of opening ourselves to the other, of instead of hiding, allowing ourselves to show up, to be present again, as I said earlier. There's also this need for vulnerability or openness of our own experiences in the world. Without that vulnerability, as scary as it might seem, we can't connect with another person. That brings me to the idea of the location. Where is shame? In an earlier video, I talked about guilt, and guilt having to do with an action that is somehow offensive to someone else, and then we feel guilty about it. Okay, so that's external to us. And guilt has the quality of being external, but shame, it's inside. It points inward, it lives in us, it erodes a sense of self-worth or self-confidence, and it has this kind of quality that can really diminish our capabilities of being in the world and are functioning really well with other people. Empathy then, again, is the opposite of that. So this is our ability to be in relationship with others, our ability to have real, honest exchanges with other people. So it's a little bit trippy because the relations that we have with other people, at the same time that they can help us through an exchange eradicate shame, our own work on our own self-worth can actually enhance our relationships with other people and then make empathy easier, so to speak, or make empathy something that can actually come into us and help us feel better about our own self-worth in and of itself. We continue to look at these oppositions in shame and empathy, but keep them in the same field, which again is this idea of a logic of exposure. We have to think about how each is aroused, right? So shame emerges when there's a sense of defeat, a sense of humiliation, a sense of failure. It can be present in our own loss or our own perception of that we didn't show up enough somewhere, or that something about us isn't good enough. Failure, defeat, even internalized. So it doesn't have to be actual. So you don't have to fail a test to feel shame. It can be your own interpretation that somehow you're not loved enough and somehow you're not good enough to receive love, which of course is a fallacy. But if we're feeling shame, then that's a kind of result of the shame experience, or vice versa. It can inspire the shame experience. Empathy is aroused by love. So to go back to this idea of the relationship, but also a relationship that's reliant on us, is this sense of self-love. Self-love enables us to love others, enables us to engage in empathy. And again, that's all taking place under this idea of being seen, right? If you can imagine meeting somebody, and I'm sure almost everybody watching this video has this experience, when you really feel seen by somebody, that almost facilitates a sense of love. When somebody really recognizes you, when someone identifies your strengths, when somebody sees what you're thinking or how you're feeling, that elicits a loving sensation, so to speak. So it is, again, the exact opposite of the shame experience, but within the same logic. The logic of shame is that we disappear, which I mentioned before, hiding, withdrawing, disappearing. We don't want to be around. We want to get away from people. The feeling of lowered self-worth inhibits our ability to get up in front of a class and give a presentation. Me, sometimes when I go to foreign countries, I get very nervous about going out to eat by myself. Now, let me just tell you, it is not a problem in my normal life, but when I start to feel reticent or somehow maybe I don't speak the language well enough, or I don't speak the language at all, I start to internalize this belief that I should withdraw. That's a little bit of shame. The idea, the contrary in terms of thinking about empathy, is appearing, being present, doing those things that feel a little bit scary. And by default, it counters the shame experience, right? So if it feels scary to make that phone call to somebody because you did something that you feel embarrassed about, doing it will actually facilitate the eradication of the shame or the lowered sense of self-worth. So it's important to think again within this idea of an empathic exchange. When we reach out, when we appear, that by itself can start to counter the feeling of lowered self-worth. That gets into the consequences of both of these experiences. If there's a surrender to shame or lowered self-worth, that leads to a consequence of more diminishment. This is the cycle of shame. It's shame leads to more shame leads to more shame. If that pattern is really operative in our lives, there usually needs to be some kind of therapeutic intervention to help stop the pattern. So I offer that to you. If it's not so embedded and it's something we can think about in terms of what I'm talking about related to empathy and exchange, we can start to combat it through our daily activities, for instance. What's fortunate is that reaching out to others, having real quality relationships with other people, making eye contact, the consequences of that, the consequences of empathy are to restore self-worth little by little, but it is a consequence. So if you engage in it, it's almost impossible for there not to be some positive effect. Part of the reason why therapeutic intervention can help this cycle of shame has to do with things that might be a little bit obvious. We go when we talk to somebody, but the quality of the relationship facilitates empathy. So the therapeutic engagement or the therapeutic alliance or the relationship that one builds with a therapist, that by itself can start to stop the shame cycle. This is one thing I think it's important to keep in mind if you are looking to be in some kind of therapy. The relationship with the therapist is really, really important. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes, depending on what the issue is, the modality of the therapy becomes less important than the relationship with the therapist. Now, this relationship, perhaps I'll talk about it in another video because it requires good boundaries, a certain level of health, a certain level of really understanding from the therapist side how to instill this is you and this is me in the therapeutic exchange. But that relationship itself can address the shame cycle and our own internal sense of lowered self-worth. As I mentioned in another video, I believe, itself can start to counter the shame experience outside of a therapeutic intervention or outside of a therapeutic intervention or within it, either one, through two mechanisms. There are actually, let's say three. One is shared laughter. So the experience of shared laughter, authentic laughter, not sarcasm, not making fun of somebody else, but real laughter, that can start to break apart lowered sense of self-worth and create an empathic exchange or relationship. Second, and I mentioned this earlier, is the concept of eye contact. Very hard to do. Try it with your best friend. Try it with somebody you really trust. It is hard to maintain, but it does create a sense of connection. And then the third is gratitude. Gratitude is easy and difficult. And maybe we'll do a video just on gratitude because I don't think it's so simple when we're having feelings of pain or suffering to just have gratitude and have that create empathy. But if we thank someone else, or we feel thankful for someone else, or we think about gratitude as taking place within relationship, it can kind of foster this empathic connection, right? So if somebody really does something kind for you, or even something small, and you reach out to them and thank them, there's kind of a good feeling that gets generated from that, which can counter shame. So if you feel a sense of lowered self-worth, and you simply say thank you to someone else for something they've done, minuscule, just practice it. That will start to break apart that feeling of lowered self-worth or that feeling of shame. So the last thing that I want to touch on is just shame as an affect. Shame gets in the way of empathy. I've said this before, but I think it's worth saying again. It is a biological sensation that floods us, that impedes our ability to connect with other people. Empathy, an empathic exchange, a connection with someone else, an envisioning of someone else's experience, a connection with somebody's physicality. And I mentioned this in the earlier video on empathy. If you watch a a sports star or a gymnast doing the activity of that sport, and you're on the couch and your body moves. That's empathy. That's a mirror neuron mechanism, a little bit different than an affect, but it still is having an empathic exchange with what you are visualizing. That connection can start to ameliorate the shame experience. So that by itself can do something to shake apart the neurological affective experience of shame. So I would say in conclusion that the experience of shame or lowered self-worth is an albatross. It is a big thing. And it takes a lot of time and effort and care to break it apart, to ameliorate it, to make it better, to grow out of it. And also it's human. So it's going to happen again. There will be moments in our lives where we experience shame. The things that we can do, little teeny things that have to do with creating empathy, that have to do with creating shared laughter or moments of shared laughter, that have to do with gratitude, little things that we can just put into our habitual life, those things can help us counter shame. Generally, in this countering, we need the presence of somebody else. Relationships are critical.